Hello and welcome to the video presentation for Module 14. This module is going to be a short one. We're going to talk about some of the other uses for augmented 6 chords. So uses beyond using them to resolve to a 5 chord. So the objectives in this video are just to explore the less common ways of using augmented 6 chords. Now all the examples in this video are going to be in 4 parts. The book has some examples that are in, other textures, and when we do our analysis, those will obviously be real music scores too. But I think it's nice to look at these in kind of a familiar context to get the concept down first. So one thing you can do with an augmented 6 chord is use it as what's called a neighbor chord to the 5 chord. So normally we're used to the augmented 6 kind of arising from a 4 chord or some kind of predominant harmony, but it can also act as kind of a extension of the 5 chord, and so we call this a neighbor chord to 5. So it can follow a 5 chord, and after that it goes to the augmented 6, it will return to the 5 chord. So for that reason we call it a neighbor chord to 5. So here we have an example in E minor, and I'll play it for you, and we want to try to find where the augmented 6 chord happens, okay, and how it resolves and what chord comes before it. So I'll play it, and then we'll talk about how to find that augmented 6th. So as you heard, this ends on what sounds like a 5 chord. So this last chord here is the 5. Now the chord before it, it has an A sharp in it and a C natural, and that of course forms an augmented 6th. So we have some kind of augmented 6th moving to a 5 chord, and that's not unusual. But look at the chord before that. That's also a 5 chord. We have B in the bass, D sharp, and F sharp. So in the key of E minor, that is 5. So we're going to a 5, then we're using this augmented 6th as a neighbor, and then we're returning from that augmented 6th back to the 5. So it's kind of like we're extending the amount of time we would normally be in the 5 chord area, okay? Then of course this is a 1 chord. So this is an example of how you can go to a 5 chord, then go to a augmented 6th, and then return to a 5. Now this doesn't have quite the same strength or finality that going from a predominant to a augmented 6 to a 5 would be, because there's more direction in that kind of progression. But this is kind of, like I said, a way of extending our time in the 5, kind of like a little side move to something that's sort of akin to 5 and then back to the 5. And there's our analysis. So another way you can use augmented 6th is to go to a chord other than 5. So here's an example in G minor. And again, we'll listen and we'll try to find where that augmented 6th chord happens, and then we'll see which chord comes before it and which chord follows it. Okay, so G minor. So I'll play this. Okay, so you can hear that this ends on a 5 chord as well, and F sharp's in the bass, so this is actually a 5-6 chord. And then we have something here. It looks kind of like it says 6-5, which means that the 3rd is in the bass. So the root of this chord is a C sharp. So this chord, I think, is a 7 fully diminished 6-5 of D, right? Because C sharp is the leading tone of D. So this is a 5-7 fully diminished of 5. And the chord that comes before that, let's look at it. So we have an E flat in the bass, right? Because that's in the key signature. And E flat to C sharp is an augmented 6. So that's our augmented 6 chord right there. You can see that it doesn't behave the way that it should, right? Instead, instead of the bass voice going down a half step to D, it actually goes up a half step to become E natural. So here we have an augmented sixth chord not followed by 5, but followed by a secondary function of 5. And that's kind of the most common thing that will follow augmented sixth besides a dominant harmony, right? It will usually be some kind of secondary function of 5. Again, kind of extending the amount of time that we use to get to the 5 chord, right? It's like drawing out the tension even more by moving sideways, getting to that 5 chord in kind of a sideways motion. So you can see the full analysis here, starting on 1 chord. That particular augmented sixth was a German augmented sixth. Then we go to the fully diminished 6-5 of 5. Then we finally end up on our 5-6. Okay. So let's look at another possibility, and that is that the lowered sixth doesn't have to be in the bass. So we're used to the bass note being the lowered sixth scale degree, and that one moving down by a half step to the 5 of the scale. That doesn't have to be the case. So it is possible to put a different note of the augmented sixth chord in the bass. Now, we might think of this as an inversion, but in reality, an augmented sixth chord doesn't have a root, right? So the root is not, the third above the bass, even though it is a sixth interval, right? So that's not this, the do, that's part of most augmented sixth chords, is not the root of the chord. In fact, there is no root of the chord. The only reason the chord works is because of the voice leading of the augmented sixth resolving to a different tone. So this isn't really an inversion. But what's happening is we're taking that augmented sixth and rearranging the notes. And so one possibility is to have, instead of the lowered sixth in the bass, you can have the augmented or the raised fourth scale degree in the bass, in which case it would go up, and then wherever the lowered sixth degree is, it would also go down. And that's probably the second most common way to structure this chord besides the flat sixth being in the bass. It's also possible to have do in the bass too, but that's a little bit more rare. Now let's look at this example here and see how this unusual augmented sixth works. So we're in the key of C major this time, and we'll be looking for that augmented sixth to see how it resolves and what comes before it. So let's give this a listen. And you can see, or hear rather, that it ends on a 5 chord in the key of C. The one that comes before it looks like a C major triad with a G in the bass, so that's going to be our 1, 6, 4. Then we have something there, right, I don't really recognize, and then our first chord looks like a 2, 6 because F is in the bass, and that F is the third of the chord, so the root of that chord is D. Now, let's look at this chord here. So let's just kind of figure out what intervals we have. We have an F sharp to a C, that's a tritone. Then we have F sharp to E flat, that's a diminished seventh. Then we have an F sharp to an A flat. F sharp to A flat is actually a diminished third. And if we inverted a diminished third, it would become an augmented sixth. So there is an augmented sixth in this chord here, but it's been flipped around so that the raised fourth scale degree is on the bottom of the chord instead of somewhere else, right? And our lowered sixth scale degree is not on the bottom of the chord anymore. But you can see, right, F sharp is the raised fourth, so that leads up to the G like it should, and that flat sixth still leads down to the G like we expected to. So this is where our augmented sixth chord is, and it's just not used in a normal way because the A flat, the lowered sixth scale degree, is not in the bass this time. So let's look at this full analysis. can see it's 2/6, and then that was a German augmented sixth there in the second chord, going to a 1/6/4, just like a German augmented sixth should, and then ending on a 5. All right, let's look at one more possibility, and that is that an augmented sixth interval can emphasize a note other than the dominant, right? So a note other than the fifth scale degree. Now, we've always been using this as a predominant harmony, something that leads to a 5 chord, right, or a 1/6/4 chord. But other augmented sixths do exist, and since we don't have to worry about the root of this chord, we're really worried about just creating that augmented sixth and resolving it correctly. We can really use any augmented sixth and go to any other note that's in the scale, right? So you can have an augmented sixth of the first scale degree or an augmented sixth of the second scale degree, right? Now, the notes that make that augmented sixth obviously will not be the same notes that make the augmented sixth that leads to the 5, but it's still an augmented sixth and the voice leading is still the same. So let's look at an example of this. This is in the key of D major. So we'll be looking for a lowered scale degree and the interval of an augmented sixth. So let's give this a listen and see if we can find where that happens. So you can hear that it ends on a 1 chord this time. And then we have a chord before that that has an E flat in the bass. And then it doesn't really look like it's any kind of chord that would form a normal cadence, right? So it's not a 5/1 cadence, it's not a 4/1 cadence, because this isn't a 4 chord, this isn't a 5 chord, right? So we don't really know what this is. It definitely sounded like it convincingly led to 1, though. Now over here we have E in the bass with a G, G repeated, and then a D. So this is a 2/7. And then over here, this has a B in the bass, 7, an F sharp, and a D. So this is a 6/7 chord. Now that kind of looks like a circle of fifths, right? 6/2, and then the only thing missing is the 5 here. But we don't actually get a 5. So let's figure out what's going on with this third chord. And so let's look at the intervals to figure that out. So we have E flat to G, that's a third. Okay, nothing weird about that. E flat to G again is a third. But then we have E flat to C sharp. And E flat to C sharp is an augmented sixth. And you can see that that C sharp resolves up by half step to D. And this E flat resolves down by half step to D. So this is like an augmented sixth of scale degree 1. Okay? So we don't really say it's augmented sixth of the chord 1, right? Because we're not really tonicizing a harmony, we're emphasizing a scale degree. So we are emphasizing the motion to the 1, the tonic scale degree, right? D. So it works just like an augmented sixth on any other, that leads to any other note, right? That leads to the 5. But in this case, it doesn't lead to 5, it leads to 1. All right? And so we actually call this, has a special name, this is called a tritone substitution, because what should be on this chord, right, is an A, but all we're doing to make it different, right, is we're substituting out that root A for something that's a tritone apart, right? Everything else is the same in this chord. So if I change that back, if I change that to an A, it would have the same function. So it sounds remarkably the same, right? But it's a much more smooth voice leading if we substitute out the bass note for something a tritone away. Right, so that happens in jazz a lot. It sounds kind of weird here in just 4 voices because we can't use all the, colorful extensions and things like that that happen in jazz harmonies. But, we still get that tritone substitution feel, right? So all a tritone substitution is is just using the interval of an augmented sixth, right? You're just subbing out whatever that bass note was for something that's a tritone apart, thus creating, a half step or a chromatic passing tone from the 2 to the, to the flatted 2, right? Or the lowered sixth scale degree, and then resolving to the 1. So here is the full analysis of that. See that it was an Italian augmented sixth, and I use the little, we say of scale degree 1, because normally it's of scale degree 5, so we have to point out that we're using a different scale degree as the destination of that augmented sixth. Okay, so let's look at an example of how we would do this in figured bass. Now there's no time signature, this is just kind of an abstract demonstration of the voice leading. So looks pretty straightforward, except for that second chord there. So we're in the key of E flat. I'll play the bass, see if we can get a sense of what's happening in this. So that sounds like the dominant. So it could resolve to that, right? Okay. So let's talk about where we're going to start. So why don't we start on maybe something that gives us some room to go somewhere. So we'll start maybe on a B flat in our soprano. And then here this says it needs a natural sixth above a D flat. So that's going to be a B natural. So we could create some contrary motion relative to our bass by moving our B flat in the soprano up to a B natural. Now you can go ahead and note that that is, in fact, where your augmented sixth chord is going to be. But you can see it's not going to 5 like it normally should. So this is going to be an unusual use of augmented sixth. Okay, but the voice leading will be the same. So this raised scale degree should resolve up by half step to become C. And that's an octave, so that's allowed in that chord. Over here we have a reposition chord with an F in the bass, so we could keep the C. But let's look ahead and see what we need to do here. So over here in this B flat chord, it says we need a seventh. So the seventh is A flat. Now we need to generate our sevenths in some kind of meaningful way. So we could create that with maybe a suspension. So what we'll do is maybe repeat it from this chord over here, which is allowed in that F chord. So that suspension creates our seventh that we need for there. Okay, great. So let's add the rest of our voices. Let's go ahead and just put our alto on G. We already have a root, a third, and a fifth, so we can double any of these. I think because of where we need to go next, why don't we keep this tenor a little bit low and double the third there. All right, let's look at this chord and see if we can figure out what we need to do. So we have our sixth, that's good. We need a fourth above D flat. A fourth above D flat is going to be a G, so we could maybe have our tenor keep that. And then we need a third above our D flat, so we could have our alto go down and cover that note. Over here we need a third and a fifth still, so we could have our alto go down to the E flat to become the third of the chord. And then our tenor could stay on G. In this chord we need, looks like a fifth, and that's it. Now I think maybe we could just leave out the fifth, and that might create better voice leading. So why don't we double our root there in the alto, and then we could triple our root with our tenor going there. Okay, that works. Now in this next chord, we have our seventh, we need a fifth, and we need a third. So our tenor could stay on F to be the fifth, and our alto could go down to the D to become our third of that chord. And if you wanted to, you could make this even smoother by adding in a passing tone over here in this sort of penultimate chord. And this actually looks kind of nice. So let's listen to how that turned out. It's voice leading, I think. Now, so let's do our analysis. This first chord is obviously a 1, right? It has E flat in the bass and its root position. Now, the second chord we said was an augmented sixth, and it has a third, it has a fourth, and it has our augmented sixth. So the augmented sixth that has a third and a fourth is the French augmented sixth. But it doesn't go to 5, right? Instead, the note that's being emphasized by that D flat to B, right, is the note C. And the note C in this key is the 6th scale degree. So we'll say this is French augmented sixth of the 6th scale degree. And then this next chord, a C minor triad with C in the bass, that's going to be our 6th chord. Over here we have F in the bass in root position, so this is our 2 chord. And we went to that E flat, so we could call this even a 2-7 if we wanted to. And then over here we have our 5-7. Okay, so that's a quick little example of how to realize these things in figured bass. So the important thing when you're dealing with augmented sixth chords that resolve to other scale degrees is, you have to use the same kind of voice leading in a regular augmented sixth, right? And we did that. We got to our extra notes in the chord smoothly, but most importantly, we created our augmented sixth through good voice leading. So in the bass, we, get to that flat 6, or in this case, flat 7 scale degree, right? Through a whole step motion from the bass, right? But then it does what it's supposed to. It resolves down by a half step to the note that we're emphasizing. Same thing with our sort of leading tone of this chord, right? Which in this case is the raised 5th scale degree. So we got that through a chromatic passing tone from B flat to B natural to C, right? Just like a regular old augmented 6th chord was. So the voice leading is always the same no matter how the augmented 6th is functioning, right? The voice leading is what makes it work. And so that's the thing that you need to have consistent no matter what happens with the harmonic function of the augmented 6th chord. Okay. So those are some examples. Yeah, the book goes into a little bit more explanation. I think there's like one more way you can use it too. But we'll see in our analysis that these kind of things are, the exception rather than the rule, right? But it's still important to know that they exist. All right, well, thanks for watching. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to save it for the next Zoom session, or you can email me, or however you want to get in contact with me is fine. And great. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.